His Excellency Carlos Ortiz de Rosas, Ambassador of the Argentine Republic to the United States, spoke before the Council on February 27, 1992 at the World Trade Center, Baltimore. The title of the speaker's address is Argentina Today. Introducing Ambassador de Rosas is Mr. Charles W. Cole, Jr., President and CEO of First National Bank of Maryland and Co-Chair, Board of Trustees of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs.
The ambassador tonight from Argentina has a very fascinating history. He was born in 1929. He's married. He has a law degree from the University of Buenos Aires. In addition, he has a graduate degree in diplomacy. He has lived in many locations in the world, including Bulgaria, Egypt, Austria, Switzerland, twice, I gather, in the United Kingdom, many times in the United States. He's been the representative in the United Nations, where at one point, really at two different times, he has been the chairman of the Security Council. And during his stay in the United Nations, he got to know President George Bush quite well. So, with that background, it's a privilege to turn the podium over to the ambassador. And at the end of his comments, we will have a brief question and answer period. I encourage everyone to please channel your questions into the area of foreign affairs and stay away from the domestic scene, if you will. So with that background, it's a privilege to turn the podium over to Ambassador Carlos Ortiz de Rosas. So thank you, sir.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be the guest speaker of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. Of course, when one says a pleasure, it's taken for granted that this is a commonplace. But believe me, in my case, it's a double pleasure. It's a pleasure for being here, but it's also a pleasure for being able to speak of Argentina today, because today it's a pleasure speaking of Argentina. Throughout my career, practically, I had to explain Argentina. Or perhaps explain is not the right word. I had to justify Argentina. And I envy all my colleagues from different parts of the world. I mean, who would ask the Swiss ambassador to explain or to justify Switzerland? Or the Danish ambassador, or the Norwegian ambassador, or the US ambassador? But Argentina had to be justified or explained as you wish. People would say, how come? I mean, you are a very rich country, and your economy is in shambles, a disaster. How is it possible that you have this high inflation? How can you live with this level of inflation? You have a homogeneous population. You have no minorities. You have no problems, really no problem whatsoever. You have a high level of culture and education, and yet you cannot put your act together. What's wrong with the country? And indeed, it was very difficult to justify my country. I tried. I was paid to do my job. I did my best, but nonetheless, it wasn't easy, because every question was right. But today is different, as you're going to see for what I'm going to say. And I'm true with what I'm saying. The years before, when I couldn't explain Argentina, I tried to evade the answer. But I'm always speak my mind, and if what I'm going to tell you would not be reflecting my true conviction, I wouldn't be here. I would not have accepted to explain Argentina today. But I think I should take advantage of this forum to briefly review the most important events, recent events, that is in Argentina, both in the field of foreign policy as well in the economy. In so doing, I shall refer in particular to those facts that have contributed to place the bilateral relations between the United States and Argentina at the high level of excellence in which they are today. Although in the introduction you were begged to direct your questions to foreign policy, let me tell you that I wouldn't mind domestic questions. Domestic questions in the United States or domestic questions in Argentina. And why domestic question in the United States? Because normally a diplomat is not supposed to deal with internal affairs of the country where one is credited. But the other day at a dinner party, I was saying to a lady sitting next to me, a very intelligent lady, we were discussing affairs, international affairs, and and I said to her, I'm sorry, but you see what's going on in the United States. It's not just the privilege of the Americans. It's the privilege of the whole world. The outcome of an election affects you all, but affects the rest of the world. So who cares? I mean, what's the outcome of an election in Argentina? For that matter, in many other countries. But the election of the United States is crucial. Not just the election. Everything that goes on in the United States is crucial for the rest of the world. So as foreigners, you must indulge with us, but we have a legitimate interest also in what's going on in this country, not just being a diplomat, any foreigner. Okay, going back to what I was saying, and here I start. With the return of democracy to Argentina in 1983, things began to change dramatically in many ways, but especially in matters of foreign policy. The restoration of a climate of total freedom, with due respect for human rights and the dignity of man, opened the doors of the free world to a new era of cooperation and understanding with Argentina. The government of President Alfonsín moved rapidly to re-establish traditional friendly relations with many Western European countries and the United States, tarnished during the years of the military government. A century-old dispute with Chile over 3 islands in the Beagle Channel was resolved through the mediation of Pope John Paul II. After long and patient negotiations at the Holy See, a satisfactory conclusion was reached through the signing of a treaty of peace and friendship. In 1989, for the first time in many years, an outgoing civilian president, elected by the will of the people, passed the presidential sash to another constitutional president, Dr. Carlos Saúl Menem. President Menem continued, even at a greater pace, the drive towards better and closer relations with the free world, but especially with its leader, the United States of America. Shortly after assuming the presidency, he instructed Argentine diplomats to engage in conversation with British representatives with the aim of normalizing diplomatic and commercial relations with the United Kingdom, which had been severed in 1982 as a consequence of the Malvinas War. We say Falkland, we say Malvinas. A formula was found called the umbrella, under which everything that was done by the British or by the Argentinians would not be construed as either giving up our rights or claiming more rights than that we have. So, in other words, it's the umbrella, or if not, is freezing the situation. But that formula enabled both countries to normalize relations. Once this bone of contention was dealt with, relations were established between the 2 countries. Needless to say, Argentina vigorously maintains the sovereign rights of the islands and hopes that in the very near future, Britain will engage in the negotiations repeatedly requested by the United Nations General Assembly aimed at reaching a peaceful solution to this dispute. It's worth saying also that the United States votes in favor of that resolution that asks for the diplomatic solution and negotiation. The British are reluctant, but they will give in at one point. Another important step in the right direction was the nuclear agreement reached with Brazil. Through this agreement, all nuclear installations in both countries are subject to reciprocal inspections, complemented by a comprehensive program of exchange of information and joint research. Furthermore, both Argentina and Brazil have jointly signed a full-scope safeguards agreement with the Atomic Agency in Vienna. In this way, both countries have placed their nuclear developments under the strictest international controls. A few days ago, President Menem and President Collor de Mello of Brazil issued a joint declaration anticipating that at the earliest possible date they will submit some amendments of a technical nature to the Treaty of Tlatelolco. This is the treaty named after a city in Mexico that forbids to have or to acquire any kind of nuclear weapons in Latin America. They would submit amendments that would enable both governments to ratify said treaty. We have already signed, but we have to ratify. All these events that I have just described show the shared decision of Argentina and Brazil to consolidate Latin America and the Caribbean as an area free of nuclear weapons. In said declarations, the two presidents clearly stated, and I quote, "In this way, Argentina and Brazil contribute clearly and positively to the establishment of a new international scenario characterized by cooperation and the generation of confidence among nations as central elements for the preservation of international peace and security." As a result of these policies, the danger of an eventual nuclear arms race between the two giants in Latin America has been totally and definitely diffused, and a policy of rivalry replaced by one of complete cooperation. In the present situation, in which a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, Iraq, has clearly violated its obligations, and other signatories as well, are also under the same suspicion, the Argentine-Brazilian agreement acquires a new dimension and shows the right way to regional cooperation for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Cooperation between the two countries to prevent the arms race was not limited to the nuclear aspects. Recently, on the occasion of the visit of President Menem to Brasilia, another important agreement was signed, binding both countries not to produce nor acquire any kind of chemical, biological, or bacteriological weapons. Shortly after, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Paraguay joined Argentina and Brazil in a similar commitment called the Declaration of Mendoza. Continuing a policy initiated during the previous administration, President Menem led a treaty for the economic integration with Brazil to a happy conclusion. Soon afterwards, two other neighbors, Paraguay and Uruguay, joined on March 26, 1990, the Treaty of Asunción, creating the Mercosur, or Common Market of the South, came into being. By the 1st of January 1995, the economies of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay will be totally integrated. In order to grasp the importance of the regional economic space attained through the establishment of Mercosur, we must bear in mind that the combined GNPs of the four member countries amounts today to $415,000 million, with a population of nearly 200 million inhabitants. As to production, this would be in itself a regional economic space concentrating 51% of the gross product and comprising 46% of all of Latin America's and Caribbean population. Taking into account this new and promising reality in the Southern Hemisphere, the U.S. has recently signed a framework agreement on trade and investment with Mercosur. The ceremony took place in the Rose Garden of the White House in the presence of President Bush. The President thus wanted to emphasize the importance he attaches to it, since it conforms with his Enterprise for the Americas initiative as a way of bringing down trade barriers in this continent. I am sure that both Mercosur and the Enterprise for the Americas initiative will greatly benefit trade with the United States. The government of President Menem also decided to put an end to the so-called Project Condor II, aimed at manufacturing an intermediate-range missile with Argentine, German, and Italian technology. This decision reflects Argentina's willingness to concentrate our technology exclusively on the peaceful exploration of space. A new agency was created to that effect, the Comisión Nacional de Actividades Espaciales, CONAE, headed by civilians and under the direct authority of the President and subject to the scrutiny and supervision of Congress. Argentina has stated that it will abide by the international guidelines of the Missile Technology Control Regime, MTCR, and would like to join the countries that share the same concerns as we do. In addition, we have begun negotiations with Brazil so as to extend our bilateral cooperation on these matters. Needless to say, these measures have been wholeheartedly endorsed by the United States and others who want to prevent dissemination of missile technology for military purposes. As a result of this situation, the U.S. administration has offered to cooperate with Argentina in space projects, and a framework agreement between NASA and the Argentine CONAE was signed to that effect on the occasion of the visit of President Quayle to Buenos Aires last July. Then came 1989, quite a year, 1989. I always believe that history plays games. I was in Paris, I was ambassador in France, and we were celebrating the Bicentennial of the French Revolution. And in that date of 1989, by the way, it was not just the French Revolution. In 1789, there was another very, very, very important event that would change the face of the world. That was the election of President Washington, first President of the United States of America. Eventful year, 89. We were celebrating 89, and the Berlin Wall was demolished. And the beginning of the end of the collapse of the communist empire in the world took place. And a new era of freedom came into being in Eastern Europe. But this was not to be so all over the world. A dictator in Iraq challenged, not the United States, challenged the New World Order, challenged the United Nations. The United Nations that for the first time since the signature of the Treaty of San Francisco in 1945 was able to perform what it was expected from the international organization according to the Charter. And by invading, when all this atmosphere of cooperation and friendship took place in the rest of the world, by invading Kuwait, Saddam Hussein challenged and the United Nations and the New World Order and those that wholeheartedly wanted to support this new state of affairs in the world. I'm not going to go into what happened because you've been following that very closely, but let me tell you, and at that point I was Deputy Foreign Minister in Argentina, and I know the intimate thoughts of the President Menem, because as soon as this took place, the President said, if there is a military operation, if there is something in retaliation by the United Nations, Argentina will contribute. And as soon as Desert Shield began in operation, Argentina sent 2 warships to the Persian Gulf and planes for transport planes, and we cooperated from the beginning to the end. Not only that, we are ready to cooperate still if there is a reinforcement of the blockade in order to make sure that sanctions are not evaded. Well, this is part of my pleasure in talking about Argentina today. This had a certain meaning because it was the first time, it was the first and only Latin American country that responded to the call of the Security Council. Argentina was. We were the only ones to do so. So it had a certain significance. But furthermore, it is the first time in our history that Argentina takes active part. Normally, we would abstain. We would be either neutral or abstain, or make a very good statement, a very good declaration of support, but that would be it, whereas Argentina took active part, as I was saying. Needless to say, President Menem's decision to send warships and planes to the Persian Gulf was warmly welcomed by President Bush, the United States, and elsewhere in the Western world. This means and proved a new spirit in our foreign policy. It's interesting that the winds that are blowing in Argentina are blowing everywhere in Latin America. The whole continent, with the only exception of Cuba and today Haiti, it's under duly elected democratic regimes. And the other thing that's got to be considered is that these elected democratic regimes, governments all over Latin America that have to be accountable to public opinion, all of them have taken on their shoulders to carry out very serious reforms, economic reforms that is. Reforms that, as you know, are not pleasant because people suffer. They are bound to suffer when you make economic adjustments, but they all know that it's for the good of the present generation, but above all, the future generation. And this is taking place all over Latin America, and this is something that ought to be bear in mind. It's very important. On this part of the continent, President Bush became far more involved and showed more interest in Latin America than most of his predecessors. On June 27, 1990, he launched his Enterprise for the Americas initiative, which aims at establishing at one point a free trade zone from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. This initiative was very well received, indeed, all over Latin America. But again, President Menem of Argentina was the first president in Latin America to give a positive reply, reacted positively to this initiative. In the middle of the Gulf crisis, in December 1990, President Bush went to Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela to prove that Latin America was again a concern of the United States. And only last year, we were celebrating the first anniversary of the initiative, of the Enterprise for the Americas initiative in the Rose Garden. He convened, he invited all the American ambassadors and highest authorities of this country, and we had a ceremony, again, to show the concern of the U.S. administration for Latin America. The new spirit that presides over Argentina has been clearly shown in our efforts to support action through collective United Nations and Organization of American States. In the first case, we are committed to provide either armed forces or observers for the plebiscite in the Middle East in the former Spanish Sahara, now again also in Yugoslavia by sending a battalion for peacekeeping purposes, eventually perhaps even Cambodia. In the regional organization, the Organization of American States, Argentina wholeheartedly endorsed the action taken by the Council in order to try and restore democracy in Haiti after the recent coup d'etat. I will now turn to a brief review of the economic situation in Argentina. Had this exposé taken place a few years ago, this is along the same lines I was saying at the very beginning, had this exposé taken place a few years ago, I would have given you the most beautiful words in my oratory, but they would have been just that, beautiful words. Today, fortunately, I can speak more convincingly and with conviction, because the facts speak for themselves. Since President Menem took office, the evolution in the Argentine economy has gone hand in hand with the developments in our foreign policy, which I have just outlined. I really don't think that we could have one without the other. But in order to fully understand the changes that have taken place, let me give you an overall view of the situation that has prevailed in my country for the past 5 or 6 decades until July 1989. The policies of state intervention in the economy, price and market controls, trade barriers, nationalization of private industries, import substitutions, subsidies, and other practices that were very much the fashion in many countries after World War II, took root in Argentina during those years, and ever since have been the cause of its gradual and steady decline. From ranking among the 10 richest nations in the world during the 30s and 40s, we ended up by being one of the many underdeveloped countries. We ranking somewhere between the 7th and 80th place. In 1989 and in 1990, we had 2 bouts of hyperinflation, reaching the incredible figure of 5,000% a year. Needless to say, there were no investments whatsoever, not even in the most vital services performed by the state enterprises, and much to the contrary, capital flight was pervasive. With production in constant decline, negative GNPs, and high unemployment, the conditions were extremely chaotic. With the reestablishment of democracy in 1983, the previous administration of President Alfonsín made 2 important attempts at redressing the economy, but both failed after a few months of relative stability, because the structure of the state and the policies of the past remain unchanged. So much so that President Alfonsín felt compelled to resign 6 months before the end of his term of office due to the uncontrollable economic and social situation. Therefore, President Menem, who had been elected to begin his mandate in December 1989, had to assume office as early as July that year. Immediately, he made it crystal clear that he would set out to introduce dramatic measures to enforce in-depth reforms, reverse the negative policies of the past, put an end to the spider web of regulations that were suffocating the economy, liberalize foreign trade, privatize inefficient state-owned enterprises, eliminate fiscal deficits, and restore confidence in the country and its institutions. Quite a task. In fact, a true peaceful and far-reaching revolution. True to his promises, 1 month later, President Menem sent to Congress 2 bills which were promptly approved and would become his main tools for achieving these goals: the reform of the State Act and the Economic Emergency Act. Based on this outcome, the government proceeded to immediately privatize mass communications network, TV, and radios that for years had been the property of the state and used by every administration for propaganda purposes. Although not extremely important in terms of revenues, this first privatization sent a clear message that President Menem meant business and was very firm in keeping his promises. Then, other very important privatization followed. The telephone company, the national airline, oil fields, real estate holdings, and petrochemical industries were privatized. Here, let me tell you, we've gone further and beyond than any other country in Latin America, because although Mexico has gone and make tremendous improvements, and probably is at the head of these economic reforms in Latin America today. They haven't touched the oil. In Venezuela, they haven't touched the oil either. But Argentina has touched the oil. It's privatizing oil fields, and the YPF, which is the state, stands for Yacimientos Petrolíferos Fiscales, the state oil monopoly, is being privatized, or at least to a great extent will be privatized and will be put in the hands of private companies, corporations. This, for those who knows a little bit of Latin America, this amounts really to quite a change. Oil was identified with sovereignty. It was a sacred cow, not to be touched. Well, President Menem, among many other things, many other inefficient enterprises, decided to do the same with the oil production. As a result of these privatizations, the government realized approximately $2.5 billion in cash receipts, plus the cancellation of about $6.5 billion in external debt obligations. Moreover, by getting rid of these inefficient enterprises, which were producing serious deficits and wasting taxpayers' money, not only were services improved, but they began paying taxes. So all in all, we have doubly benefit from their privatization. But still it's a lot to do. President Menem has given precise instructions to the Minister of Economy, Domingo Cavallo, the architect of the economic change, that all companies, this is a quotation, that all companies under the state reform program will have to be transferred to the private sector by the end of 1992, this year, so that the state will work to provide only such services as education, health, and security. This wave of privatizations will become effective this year and will include, among others, oil refineries, shipyards, natural and thermal gas power production and distribution, petrochemicals, railway systems, water companies, shipping lines, subway systems, and many industries under the control of the Defense Ministry. Those that be interested, take note. You may participate. Let me tell you, foreign capital is exactly in the same footing as Argentine capital and is most welcome. Revenues from the sales are expected to be approximately $3 billion in 1992 and $400 million in 1993, all of which would be set aside for use in debt reduction operations. Privatization of state-owned companies, however, only represent a part, although an important one, of the new economic policy. Other measures must also be mentioned in the same context. In order to open up the economy, both in terms of flow of trade and of capital and technology, existing barriers have been eliminated. Import tariffs have been cut or greatly reduced. They are now 22% on finished goods, 13% on production inputs, 5% on primary products, and 0 tariff for capital goods. Export tariffs and non-tariff barriers to imports and exports have been either eliminated totally or considerably reduced. Thus, all restrictions and discriminatory procedures on the entry of capital and technology from abroad have disappeared. As I was saying, foreign investments are now on exactly an equal footing with the Argentine capital in every way. At the same time, price, wages, interest rates, and exchange controls have been suppressed, as well as a complex network of subsidies and implicit taxes which distorted the operation of the markets. In order to benefit the consumer through a true market economy with greater competition that would result in lower prices, on October 31st of last year, President Menem signed a decree deregulating vast sectors of the economy. As a result, all restrictions on the supply of goods and services, with a few exceptions related to national security, were eliminated, as also were numerous regulations concerning working hours and working days for business, transportation, and port activities. The same decree eliminated regulatory bodies overseeing the grain, beef, forestry, fishery, sugar, and wine industries, and removed all subsidies. In other words, freedom became the rule and restrictions the very rare exception. No economic program could succeed without fiscal discipline or with high levels of inflation. So, as a first step, the Menem administration adopted severe measures to greatly reduce public spending and establish a new tax system that would mean an end to the chronic fiscal deficit, the main source of inflation in Argentina. Under this reform, general tax revenues have been increased, while other taxes that hindered commercial transactions have been phased out. As a complement to the existing corporate and personal income taxes, a new 16% value-added tax on goods and services have been imposed. Tax reforms have also included the creation of a special tax regime designed to encourage repatriation of flight capital. Speaking of taxes, it is not my intention to further tax your patience. So, if you could bear with me just a few more seconds, let me just add that revenues have increased from 17% of the GDP in 1989 to 22% in 1991, the highest in 20 years in Argentina. The streamlining of the administration plus the privatization drive have resulted in the reduction of 100,000 employees who have been transferred from the public to the private sector. Through voluntary early retirement with adequate compensation and future privatizations, another 120,000 people will leave the overstaffed government administration. I have just referred to some facts. Many others could also be mentioned to give an exact account of what's going on in Argentina, such as the so-called Convertibility Law, approved by Congress on April 1st, 1991. This law, probably the cornerstone of the entire economic reform, pegged the Argentine currency to the dollar at a fixed rate of exchange, 1-to-1 now, and prohibited the printing of money without the corresponding backing in foreign currency or gold. In other words, not a single peso, as I said equivalent to $1, can be put in circulation without placing $1 in reserve, and anyone can buy as many dollars as they wish by giving in exchange an equal amount of pesos. Thus, we're creating the conditions to reestablish confidence in the Argentine currency and to put an end to the inflation that the country has suffered for so many years. It's interesting to remark as well that any foreign corporation or any private individual operating in Argentina can repatriate dividends, the entire capital, whatever they please, with entire freedom. There is absolutely no barrier whatsoever to repatriate 100% of revenues or capitals. As a consequence of these measures, interest rates plummeted from an incredible 300% or more a year to around 14%. Inflation went down. That's less than I want to pay for American Express. I paid 18%. If I delay in my payments, I'm charged 18%. 14% is really fantastic for Argentina. As a consequence, inflation went down from 20% a month in July 1989, 200% a month in July 1989, 200% a month, to 0.6% last December. And on this January, there was an unexpected jump to 3%. The Minister of Economy confirmed that his goal for 92 still is a 7% inflation for the whole rate of inflation for the whole year. Of course, the stock market in Buenos Aires reacted bullishly to this encouraging situation. The average value of all stocks traded in 1991, average, increased 346%, setting a world record. I could go on into other details, very important ones indeed, that would further show the dramatic improvement in the economy of my country. but I'm afraid I would be stretching my time and your tolerance. So let me conclude by saying that in Argentina today, inflation and interest rates are down dramatically. Revenue collection is up. Industrial production is up, as are local and foreign investments. Unemployment is down, and probably the most important factor in an economy, confidence, is up. The overwhelming support for the changes brought about by President Menem was reflected in the recent midterm elections. All these in-depth reforms were achieved under the strictest respect for democratic institutions and individual and collective rights enshrined in the Constitution, with complete freedom of the press and the total independence of the judiciary. Proudly, in Argentina, the nearest thing to a miracle. Thank you.
Ambassador, the First National Bank of Maryland is delighted to give you a credit card below 18%. This is the formal...
I pay promptly, so I don't ever come to... I pay promptly. But if I'm going on a holiday, I'm going on vacation, I'm 1 month delay, I'm charged 18%. I think it's too much.
This is the formal, informal part of the session where we will now have questions and answers, and please proceed.
Yes, sir.
I know Mexico has a lot of problem with pollution, and Eastern Europe does. Is there a big pollution problem in Argentina?
Not in Argentina as a whole. We have certain degree of pollution in the industrial belt of Buenos Aires, and not in the whole industrial belt. One part of the industrial belt of Buenos Aires, the capital city, which has 8 million people. In certain pockets, there is pollution and danger to the environment. So we have approved new regulation, and these industries, they have to adapt to the new regulations in a term of 5 years, so that the whole thing would have to disappear in 5 years. In the rest of the country, there is no pollution danger. It's a big country, and we haven't got that much concentration of industries in one certain place causing pollution. Yes, sir.
Has the telephone company been privatized yet in Argentina?
Totally.
Totally.
Yes.
Who's running it?
Well, the phone company was privatized, was one of the first privatizations, was privatized in 1991. Well, it began in 1990, actually. The whole thing ended last year. The territory of Argentina was divided in two parts in order to prevent the monopoly of the communications. The northern part and the southern part, and it was open to international tender. The southern part of Argentina was, the tender was won by Telefónica of Spain with Argentine corporations and who else? Well, mainly Spain. The northern part was, the tender was bid successfully by Telecom or Communications of France, plus Stet from Italy. They are both operating. They are improving tremendously the service that the phone company is supposed to render, and the tariffs have remained more or less the same. I was just reading this morning in a paper from Buenos Aires that in the next 5 years, 900,000 telephones which were not operating very well will be in extremely good, be in operating condition, and they will install 1 million new lines. That is the northern part of the country. With probably in 10 years, there will be no more demand. I mean, the offer would be, the supply of the phone company in the north of Argentina would give complete satisfaction to the demand. Yes. This lady here, then another lady here, a gentleman there, another one there. And I must not overlook over there. Yes.
President Menem is such an important person in the affairs of Argentina now. what is his term of office, and is there still a threat from the Peronistas?
Well, President Ministers of Office, a constitutional term of office in Argentina is 6 years. So his term of office will come at the end, to an end in 1995. There's a big debate in Argentina with whether he's a true Peronista or not. To tell you the truth, there are many people that say, well, he's no longer a Peronista. And his answer is, I'm a true Peronista. Because if Perón would be alive today, he would be introducing the same changes I am introducing to the Argentine economy. He was no fool. He knew that the system would have failed, and he would introduce the changes. So I'm a true Peronist. Of course, Perón is dead, and he cannot answer the question. But the fact is, the fact remains that whether you want to call it Peronist or not, he has succeeded in enlarging enormously the political support, because today he has not only the support of the Peronists, but also he has the support of a large chunk of the independents in Argentina, which are the more numerous party of the independents, they're not committed, plus the liberals. Now, the liberals in Argentina has a different connotation from the liberals in the United States. The liberals in Argentina is totally the reverse of the liberals in the United States. These are the people that believe in free everything, liberal economy, no intervention by the states and everything. Well, the liberals are wholeheartedly supporting the president because they say, well, the president stole our program. The thing is that the liberals never got elected in Argentina, but President Menem did. So, yes.
How about your oil production?
I'm sorry?
Your oil production.
Oil production.
How many barrels a day are you producing, and what do you export, and what do you import?
Well,
yourself, and what do you import?
Argentina is self-sufficient in oil, and we are producing now, I don't know in barrels of oil, I can tell you in metric tons. This is 32 million metric tons. I don't know how many barrels that is. But we are increasing our production, and we are exporting some of our oil. We begin to export oil. Now, in the last 2 years, so many foreign companies, well, it began actually under President Alfonsín already, began under what was called Plan Houston. It was launched in 1986, and it has been continued by the Menem administration. Now, with the participation of foreign companies, the production is increasing substantially. There is a lot of activity, and new fields are being discovered, and secondary fields that lack the technology to take advantage of further exploitation now are being exploited. So oil production is up, and the estimates is that it is going to improve even much more in the very, very near future. Yes, I'm coming. I'm coming to this side. I'm coming to that side too.
On the Malvinas, is your government
Good for you.
to accept the self-determination of the inhabitants of the Malvinas? And if not, what about the Mexican cession, where the United States seized northern Mexico? Does your government accept that, the borders of the United States today? And if so, does it, what legal or moral differences do you see between the United States seizing the northern third of Mexico and Britain seizing the Malvinas?
Well, frankly, I'm not very familiar with the situation of the northern part of Mexico in the United States. It's not a diplomatic answer, believe me. It's just that I really am not that familiar. But Malvinas, I do know. Well, when you look at the map, it's very simple. The situation is very simple. When you look at the map, and you have Malvinas at 300 miles, not even, from Argentina, 250 miles from Argentina, the Argentine coast, and 8,000 or more miles from England. There was no one born British there. At the expansion, at the time of the expansion of the colonies, the British landed there, as they landed in this country, as they tried to land in the Argentine mainland 3 times, and they did it everywhere. It was the rules of the game. The imperial powers were expanding all over the world. Okay, so they did, and they landed in the Malvinas in 1833. What happens then is that in 1833, Argentina was already 23 years independent country, an independent country. When the British signed the first treaty, because we had excellent relations with the British for many, many years, when the British signed the first agreement recognizing the independence of Argentina, he didn't do that because they love Argentina, but because they hated Spain, let's face it. And that was one way to prevent Spain from going back to the former colonies. So they recognized the independence of Argentina. At that point, they didn't, in the treaty signed with Minister Canning, no provision, no reservation was made saying we signed this with regard to Argentina, but we make a reservation that these islands are British because of our legal rights are British. They didn't say that. In 1833, they landed there, and the population that was there, not a very big population, we were 80-something Argentinians there, and there was a governor, and it was a whaling station more than anything else. The 83 Argentine inhabitants were placed on board a ship, sent some to the Argentine coast, some to England, and they were replaced by British soldiers. And ever since, they have been the occupation of the Malvinas by the British. Now, what we claim is this is a transplant population. So, of course, if you ask self-determination now, they will going to choose to remain Britain. But this is a transplant population. It's not the original population. And that's why we claim that this is not a legal right. This is basically the situation. But let me add that according to international law, we never recognized the occupation of the Malvinas by the British. And although we had the best possible relation for many, many years, every year there was a note presented by the Argentine ambassador in London rejecting the occupation and claiming the evacuation of the islands and the return of the islands to the legal owner, Argentina. It's a very peculiar case, Malvinas, you know. When I was ambassador to the United Nations, many representatives, mostly from third world countries, came to me and asked me, why are you so insistent? Why do you insist so much with the Malvinas? Look at Argentina. I mean, 3 million square kilometers. Why do you need these islands lost in the southern seas there? Who cares? And it was a very good question. So I had to think of a very good answer. And for many days, or many weeks, I pondered. I said, well, they are right in asking this. What should I reply? And then I realized what it was. When Argentina became independent from Spain, Argentina had what is today Argentina, plus in the northwest, we had an exit to the sea, to the Pacific Ocean. We had southern Bolivia was part of Argentina. Southern Peru was part of Argentina. The whole of Uruguay was part of Argentina. And in certain territories in our border with Brazil were part of Argentina. So we were a huge country. And without firing a shot, we let the Uruguayans become independent because that was the will of the people of Uruguay. So they said, we want to be independent, they were. The Bolivians wanted to become independent, and they were. And the Peruvians as well. With Brazil, we submitted to arbitration our dispute over the territories. The dispute gave some territories to Brazil, some territories to Argentina. With Chile, we have had disputes, like the one of the Beagle Channel I mentioned, but also, we have a borders of 3,500 miles with Chile. We're bound to have problems of this kind. Every problem was solved through mediation. So what happened with the Malvinas? It was the only territory that was taken from Argentina by force. And Argentinians will never admit that. I am sure the United States will react the same way. I'm sure, absolutely positive, that a foreign power would take one part of your country, this wonderful country of yours, by force. You would never admit that until the end of time. There was, yes, here, and I come in this way immediately.
My question is really a follow-up question to your earlier question. What really happened to the ghost of Perón? But what I mean by that question is there obviously are many labor unions and Peronist leaders who have had some interest affected by the new policy of Mr. Menem. I just wondered how has that impacted on what has been their political reaction to their forces to what has happened, and how has Menem overcome that?
Well, that's a very good question. Let me tell you what Perón said. Perón used to say, the syndicates are the, how do you say in English? Spinal, the columna vertebral, how do you say it?
Spinal cord.
Spinal cord? Okay. He used to say,
Backbone.
Backbone, that's right. He used to say the syndicates are the backbone of the Peronist party. So when the leaders, syndicate leaders went to him to ask for things, do this, do that, I said, listen, whoosh, stop there. I said it's the backbone. I never said it was the head. Well, I think Menem applies a little bit this policy. All these changes, economic changes, meant that this is obvious, that the syndicates are losing power, are losing ground and a lot of power. But what happens is that all these changes that are affecting Argentina, improving the situation, the benefits are felt by the working people, not the leaders. The leaders, you know, they have a very good life. They have good income, all sort of benefits, and but the people that really works in the factories now, when all this privatization, with all this economic drive, they are better paid. Their unemployment, I forgot to mention, unemployment went down from 12% to 5% since in the last 2 years. So there is a demand of work, and they are losing ground. Of course, that doesn't mean that the rights of the people, of the workers, are forgotten or overlooked. But in answer to your question, I would say that yes, the syndicate leaders, they don't have the power they used to enjoy many years ago under the Perón regime. Right now, before Congress, there is a law, that is to say a bill, that will be discussed by Congress immediately, in the next in the very near future, flexibilizing the labor system, because labor laws in Argentina and regulation was one of the things that were stifling the economy, tremendously stifling the economy. A corporation wouldn't dare to fire someone because of what they had to pay as indemnities. And of course, they wouldn't dare to engage anyone because of the problems that they would represent. So either they were working in the black market of labor, or it was a total distortion of the economy. Now, the situation is changing, and in fact, the worker realized that he's better off with the new situation. We had so many labor laws that were stifling the economy, as could have had the most developed country, but Argentina was not a developed country, and we had labor laws that perhaps could be justified in a developed country, but not in Argentina.